Hello, in this video, I'm going to be showing you examples of different supports, which are essentially the surfaces that we make our paintings on. So this includes different types of wood, different types of paper, canvas, linen, things like this. Supports is the term that we use to describe the thing that supports our painting, that holds our painting. So I'm going to turn the camera around here and show you some examples that I have in my studio and talk about the benefits, the pros and the cons of each of these surfaces or supports, and hopefully answer some questions that you might be wondering about. So let's get into it. Okay, so when you're picking your support for your painting, there are a few factors that you probably want to think about before you start looking for your materials. The first thing to think about is what painting medium do you plan to use for your painting? There are a few main sort of popular mediums that artists, painters will use. The first one is oil paint. The second one is acrylic paint. The third one is watercolor. The fourth one is gouache. Some artists will use casein, which is a milk-based paint, a milk protein-based paint. There's egg tempera, which uses the egg white the egg yolk mixed with pigment and a few other mediums to create a painting. Those are sort of main mediums that painters will use to create their work and that you'll see most often. That's one of the biggest factors that's going to dictate where you choose to select your supports from. The second thing to think about is the scale of your work. Now, are you planning to make something really small and kind of handheld, or are you planning to make something as large as one of your bedroom walls? Depending on the scale of the artwork, you might want to pick one support over another. And once I go through all of these, I think you'll start to figure out which ones would work best for medium and the scale of your artwork. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of just jump right in and show you what I have currently here in my studio. The first thing I'll start with is paper. Paper seems to be one of the first types of supports that artists use. Most of us begin making artwork with pencil and paper, so I think a lot of people are familiar with making artwork on paper. And sometimes artists forget that, or they've just never heard that you can also paint on paper, and it starts to open up some really interesting doors depending on the kind of work you want to make. So I have a few examples of different papers that will work for different mediums and materials. This first piece of paper here is a toned piece of printmaking paper made by the company Stonehenge or Legion. I never remember which one is which. But the paper is called Stonehenge Legion paper. And it's a printmaking or drawing paper. It's fairly heavyweight, so it's not really flimsy, and it has quite a bit of body to the paper, if that makes sense. So it's a pretty stable paper. It's also 100% cotton and acid-free, which just kind of helps us figure out how archival the paper actually is. So if you use this paper, you can trust that it will hold up for maybe 100 to 200 years. And depending on how it's stored and framed, it might even last longer than that. So it's a pretty reliable paper. It tends to be a higher end type of art paper. Reeves BFK is another really popular printmaking paper that artists will use to paint on, both of which are advertised as printmaking papers. Those tend to be a little bit more heavyweight papers, partially because printmakers will often sort of soak the paper before they make the print on it, and they need paper that's going to be able to withstand these multiple steps of their different types of process in making prints. So this is one kind of paper that you could make artwork on, and this would be suitable for watercolor. It would be suitable for gouache, acrylic painting, without needing any sort of primer or any sort of ground to seal the paper. Now, if you wanted to use oil paint on a surface like this, like any other surface, you'll need to prepare the surface properly, and I'll talk about that in another video where I go over grounds and priming your supports. Otherwise, it's a really good material to paint on. The nice thing about working on paper is that you already have a surface that's really suitable for drawing. So if you like to draw and you like to paint over your drawings, paper might be a really, really good option for that. What I like to do is use paper for gouache paintings, which is a water-soluble paint that has a matte sort of surface quality. It's a lot like watercolor, although you can paint your light colors over your dark colors, or essentially it's an opaque watercolor medium. But I prefer to work on harder surfaces or more stable surfaces. So what I've been doing is cutting down pieces of masonite panels and then sealing them before gluing this Stonehenge Legion paper right onto the surface and weighing that down with a stack of books to get a really nice, flat, smooth, even seal and even sort of glue up for the panel. And now I have, it's almost like working on a board or a panel for my gouache paintings, which I really, really like. So those are a few ways to use paper for gouache and acrylic or for drawing and painting. There are papers that are made specifically for oil painting. And oil paint, unlike acrylic or watercolor or gouache or tempera, the organic oils in oil paint will seep through your, they can seep through your binder and your primer into your support. And if you're working on paper, sometimes if you flip your paper over, you'll see these very subtle kind of like blotches of oil that have soaked through the paint into the paper. And that's what's really dangerous about not properly sealing your surfaces for oil paint. But that being said, there are companies out there like Legion or Stonehenge, whatever that company's called, and Arches, which is another really popular paper making company. Both of them have started making, or have been making for a while, oil painting paper, which is a paper that has a chemical binding compound in the paper that helps to resist against the effects of oil seeping through and deteriorating the paper. I will say it's not perfect in my experience. I always can see a little bit of that oil kind of drying through the paper, but it's nowhere near as bad as using a separate sort of paper that's not designed for oil painting. So if you're an oil painter and you want to work on paper, because it's really easy to store, it's really lightweight, it's easy to cut and reshape, this is a really good kind of paper. This is the Legion oil paper or Stonehenge oil paper, and I've really enjoyed using theirs and Arches paper. So that's an option for oil painting. The other thing I want to mention is you can also paint on any sort of paper, honestly. One thing that I've really enjoyed doing is taking a Bristol kind of vellum surface type of paper. So Strathmore Bristol paper is a really good paper. This is their kind of like premium version, their Series 500 of Bristol. It's a little bit more archival than their other series within their Bristol line of paper. It's advertised as being archival quality, acid-free, 100% cotton. Sometimes they'll tell you what the surface is like. This has a little bit of a toothy finish to it. But what I like about this paper is that it's also pretty heavy stock. So it's pretty heavyweight paper, which tells me that it can stand up to quite a bit of like adding and subtracting material on the surface. It's able to be sort of torn and glued, and it becomes a little bit more sculptural in some ways than like a newsprint or a more entry-level type of drawing paper. But if I was going to make a drawing that I wanted to paint over, what I've been doing or have done in the past is I will glue the paper to a piece of plywood or masonite, and then I will seal it with something like a matte medium, which I can show you really quickly. So this is matte medium. There are a few companies that make this type of medium. It's essentially an extender that you'll find in a lot of other acrylic paints, but it's just that binder extender. So it has kind of a milky color to it. I don't know if I'll be able to open this right now. I haven't used it in a long time. Yeah, it's pretty stuck at the moment, but it has kind of a milky surface, and when it dries, it'll dry clear to a matte surface. So I'll use this to seal paper like Bristol, and then I'll paint over that with oils. And I've been able to make a few paintings that way and haven't really seen any sort of big issues with working that way. I've sort of come to that technique through other artists that have also said it works for them. It might not be the most archival way to make paintings on paper, but it works pretty well in my experience. So you can also use it as your like gluing agent to get your paper onto your panel. So that's another option for painting on paper. Let me go ahead and move this out of the way. So if you don't like painting on paper, and you prefer to work on a smoother surface that has that sort of strength and integrity like wood, there are a few options that you can use for painting on wood. The most common in, I would say, like higher ed painting studios today is masonite panels or a hardboard panel. And if you go to a hardware store or a big box lumber store like Home Depot or Lowe's, and you walk down the aisles of plywood and masonite, you'll see a few different types of wood. And the big things to kind of keep in mind and look out for are the types of wood. So what I'm talking about right now when I say hardboard or, masonite panel, is a type of board that is generally really smooth on one side and tempered on the back side. So it has this toothy finish that was imprinted by the mesh screen that this is pushed against. Essentially, this panel is made with many little pieces of wood and a glue binder kind of agent to create this hard panel. And there's another type of panel, pardon me while I figure out some of the terminology here. There's another type of panel that you can buy that's similar to this that's called MDF. And MDF stands for medium density fiberboard, and it's different than your hardboard or your masonite. The biggest difference is that MDF is not compressed to the same degree as a hardboard is. And the reason why this is an important thing to keep in mind is that if you're painting on MDF, so not the hardboard, it's a lot more porous. And by that, I mean it's more susceptible to moisture soaking into the MDF. As opposed to hardboard, which, like I said, is really firmly compressed. It's a lot harder of a material just in terms of, trying to drill into this or trying to work with this or cut this into different pieces. It's a lot harder for moisture to get in and compromise the material. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It will happen if you leave this on your floor in your garage or in your basement and there's water on the floor. That water will make its way into the fibers of even a masonite panel. So masonite tends to be a more archival material than MDF, but you'll still want to make sure that you're really properly sealing your masonite panels. So I like to prime both sides of my masonite panels. If you only prime one side, what tends to happen is it'll sort of flex and dry to this sort of bowed shape. And the way to fix that is to prime the other side. Some artists will just put like an X or a couple of different lines instead of painting the entire reverse side or back side. That tends to do the trick too. I've gotten in the habit of just painting the whole thing, just to, again, sort of protect it from moisture. And actually on this panel, I used a seal, I think a latex-based sealant made by Kilz, K-I-L-Z. And that helps to protect against oil and moisture and things like that. So the other side is primed with a couple layers of acrylic gesso, and then I actually had an old painting on here that I didn't like, and I painted over it with a oil ground. So this is definitely suitable for only oil painting now, since it has an oil primer on it. The nice thing, or the benefit of using masonite panels or even MDF panels, is that they are made and they're to a very smooth finish. There's really no texture, there's no tooth to these. You don't have the weave of canvas. So if you like painting on a really, really smooth surface that's hard and won't flex or bow, masonite panels are probably going to be what you'll probably prefer. It's also very affordable. So they sell, on average, I would say I can find a sheet of 4 feet by 8 foot masonite or hardboard at Lowe's or Home Depot for around $15 per sheet. So, if you have access to cut that down into different custom sizes, you can get a lot of different size panels out of that are, fairly mid to large scale paintings. It also works well to cut into really small panels, even smaller than this, to create for studies and paintings that you might be traveling with. And it's also not that heavy. So there are a lot of benefits to using masonite panels. So something to think about. All right, moving on. So kind of in line with the wood surfaces, I also have painted more so in the last like 3 or 4 years. Most of my paintings that are on any kind of wood surface are on a piece of plywood like this, some sort of kind of hardboard plywood. This isn't the type of plywood that is used in building homes for floorboards and things like that. It's a little bit more mid to high range type of plywood. There are 2 types that I've been buying over the last couple of years. This is sandy plywood, S-A-N-D-E. I believe it's a type of pine. I could be wrong. It's a relatively newer plywood that Home Depot carries, and I've really enjoyed it. It's really lightweight, which is nice, and really, really durable and strong. It's not going to flex or break or bow just by, dropping it or leaning something against it. So it's a pretty stable type of wood. You can see on this side, there's some paint from a sculpture that I had made in grad school, where I just decided to cut down the sculpture after the show and use it for panels for painting. So that's what this is from. Sometimes I'll just prime this and gesso this and sand it smooth to get a surface that then can be toned and painted, like this panel. I also will go with the same material generally. This sandy plywood or birch plywood is another kind of plywood I've used recently. And I'll cut strips of it to then make my cradle for the back of the panel, which would then bring it up to like an inch depth, which is really good for framing and float frames and adding hardware to the back. That way I'm not screwing into the panel that the painting is on. So it just helps sort of protect the painting a little bit more. If you ever had to re-cradle it or reframe it, you don't have to worry about having to fix holes and worry about moisture getting into the panel as opposed to the cradle. So that's one way that I've used plywood for a painting surface. Again, it's pretty smooth, but if you look closely, you can see some of the texture from the wood grain, but also from the gesso that this colored ground is painted over. So it's not quite as smooth as masonite will be, but it's pretty close. The other thing that I like to do with plywood is to mount canvas to it. So this is a piece of plywood, as you can see on the back, that's been sealed with a product called GAC 100. I talk about this in my grounds and sizing video that you have also seen or will be watching soon. And then I glue my canvas to the wood panel with a PVA glue or a pH neutral glue. I use this one from the brand Linico. It's a bookbinding glue. It's permanent. It can also be reversed, which is really nice if you ever wanted to undo your canvas on your board or your paper on your board. This is the same material that I used for my little paper panel boards that I make. But it's archival, which is really important. So you don't have to worry about this adhesive damaging your wood panel or damaging your canvas or damaging your paper. So this is what I use. There are a few different companies that all make this product. It's all pretty much the same thing. As long as it says it's a PVA adhesive, you're pretty much going to get the same thing. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's what I use to glue down a piece of canvas before I then prime it and gesso it with my acrylic gesso ground. So if you look closely here, I'm gonna change to my other lens here. You can see that sort of toothy surface of my canvas. And I'll put a few coats of gesso on here, and then I'll sand it to get it a little bit smoother. I like canvas for its tooth, but I don't like things to be kind of sharp and rough, so I tend to go through once with a light sanding just to smooth things out. But this is a really nice way if you like painting on the feeling of canvas, the surface quality of canvas, but if you don't like that kind of bounciness the canvas can have if it's stretched. So this is a really good solution for that. Something else I've been doing with wood that I really like a lot too is mounting that oil paper that I was talking about earlier onto plywood. So this is a cradled piece of plywood. It's really kind of haphazardly, put together with some plywood as cradles on the back. But this is painted on that oil painting paper. I believe I also had one coat of acrylic gesso on here as well. This was in my example for the self-portrait painting project that I've taught in the past that went through a few other iterations until it sort of landed in this current place, which it might be finished, it might not be finished. We'll see. I'm just sort of letting it sit for a while. But I like having that oil paint paper on here because it provides a very even surface quality in terms of the tooth or the texture. Whereas like I was showing with the wood, sometimes the gesso, it'll have more peaks and valleys between marks of the gesso. I think it's the way that it hits the wood that might create some of that. It could be my brush that I'm using. But the nice thing about using the paper is that you're starting with a nice, even, fairly absorbent surface from that paper, which I really enjoy. So again, I prefer to work on a hard surface that doesn't bounce, that remains sort of consistent throughout the whole painting process. So wood is my solution for that. And that's pretty much it for wood. And, again, it kind of depends on your budget, what kind of wood panel you want to use. I've gotten in the habit of buying things at that 4-foot by 8-foot size, and then I'll have the employees at Home Depot or Lowe's cut it for me. I think Home Depot cuts it. Lowe's, I don't think does that for customers anymore. So if you need to cut it down to fit it in your vehicle, make sure that you're getting it from a store that actually cuts it down for you in the store before making the purchase or even making your trip out to the store. But sandy plywood is a little bit more affordable than birch plywood or maple plywood. I've used both of those too. It just depends on how much I'm willing to spend at the time. But those higher end boards are a lot stronger. I think they also tend to be a little bit more archival. And you can start to feel that archival quality when you actually have the material in front of you. And, if you're playing with the plywood and you can feel it already chipping off, that's probably a sign that it's not a very well-made product or that it's not going to hold up very well over decades and decades of time against things like moisture or being, transported from location to location. So those are some of the things that I tend to think about when I'm buying my material. And even when I'm looking at one big sheet of the plywood, I try to pick the plywood piece that looks the best, that looks the straightest in terms of, warping, things like that. And then also along those edges. Most of my panels, I still keep that very outer edge from the 4x8 sheet. So it's really important to make sure that I'm not getting pieces that are, have a lot of imperfections or dents in them. So be on the lookout for things like that if you're buying things in a Home Depot store or Lowe's. Okay, so moving on. There is another type of surface that I did not mention in the intro, but as a relatively new type of support for oil painting. And it's the most archival of all of the types of supports that we have available to us, even more so than linen, which is considered to be a very archival type of canvas. This is a piece of aluminum composite material panel, otherwise known as ACM panel. This was one that was produced by the company Artifex, Artefex, and they buy these metal panels. I don't think that they actually make them. I think they just purchase them and then cut them down, and then they prepare the surfaces for different types of painting. So this was one that was designed exclusively for oil painting. It has an oil ground on the panel. So when I ordered it, I was able to take it out of the plastic and then just start painting right away with my oils. Didn't need to prepare the surface in any other way. But the nice thing about working on ACM panels is that they are super, super weather resistant. So this is essentially the same material that cities will use to create their road signs on the sides of highways and roads and streets. Stop signs are made out of a similar material. So at one point, somebody in the industry of art materials realized, hey, if we're using this material for signs in nature, outdoors, that are constantly exposed to elements of the sun or effects of the sun, elements of climate and atmosphere, and these signs are still holding up, this is probably a really good material for making fine art paintings that could then go into museums and are a lot easier to conserve. There's a lot less maintenance that conservationists have to do when artwork is made on a material like this. So you don't have to worry about the effects of water damaging this because nothing in this panel is organic. These are all inorganic materials that are making this panel. There's essentially a piece of plastic or PVC type of plastic in between two very, very thin pieces of aluminum. And that's what makes this aluminum composite material or ACM panel. There's another term that I'm forgetting right now that people also will use to describe this material, but it's actually the brand. I think it's called Dibond, D-I-B-O-N-D. Dibond panel is the name of the company that produces a higher end version of this material. So you might hear someone say, oh, it's painted on Dibond panel, but that's the same material as an ACM panel, just like this. So anyways, this is one of the most archival materials to work on. It's probably one of the more expensive ones to work on for that reason too. It's, as you can imagine, it takes a while to produce these. They're also sometimes a little bit heavier. They can be costly to ship. This one on its own isn't very heavy. I'd say it's similar to a piece of masonite at this size. But you just have to, again, sort of plan out the work you want to make. If, let's say you have a commission for a portrait, or, somebody wants you to make a painting that they're going to cherish for generations and generations, and you want to ensure that you're going to produce a painting that will last that many generations, I would first look at an ACM panel, because that'll ensure that you're able to give a little bit more of a guarantee that this is going to be around for a really long time. And that way the customer or the collector knows they're really getting their money's worth, and that you really know how paintings are going to be affected by things like time and those other effects that I was talking about earlier. Okay, so that's the last of my hard panel type surfaces. To finish us off here, I have one other thing, actually two things. This is something that I was going to mention as another substitute for things like plywood or masonite. This is a piece of foam core that is acid-free and also archival. I purchased sheets of this when I was producing prints for patrons and collectors, and I was packaging prints. I didn't want to use cardboard or cardstock or something that was going to potentially harm the print, because the prints were giclée prints that are museum quality and archival. And as soon as you seal it with something that's not archival, you kind of start to compromise that integrity of the print. So I purchased foam core panels that are archival and acid-free, and I've met artists who will use this material, and they'll cut it to different sizes, like 8x10 or 16x20, and then they'll glue with an adhesive like this canvas or paper onto the surface, and they'll use that as their support for their painting. The biggest benefit of doing that is the weight. So these are extremely lightweight pieces of material. As you can see, they're essentially like styrofoam, right? Like there's a lot of air bubbles, in this material, which takes off a lot of weight as this gets larger and larger. So you can make pretty large paintings that feel very, very lightweight, which then are a lot cheaper to ship and easier to ship. So that's one of the biggest reasons I'll see artists using things like foam core or gator board as the support for their paper or their canvas. So I just wanted to mention that real quick. All right, and now, lastly, I will close out the video by talking about canvas. So, canvas is one of the most common types of painting surfaces or supports for paintings. Cotton is generally what canvas is made out of nowadays, and you can get canvas in two main styles. There is cotton canvas, which is what I'm holding right now, but you can also get linen canvas. And if I hold these together and bring them up closer to the camera, what you'll notice is, first of all, the color of the material is different, right? So on the cotton canvas here, it's a lot lighter, but if we look closer, we can see that the weave of each is a little bit different as well. The reason why the color is different, I'll start there, is because cotton canvas is made from cotton, and your linen is made from flaxseed, which is also what linseed oil is made out of. And flax seeds, they produce this very, well, actually, I might be wrong here. I know it's made from flax, but it might not be from the seed of the plant. So the thing about flax is that it makes a very strong type of fiber that is really, really, really strong and resistant to moisture. And that was the biggest reason why artists throughout our history chose linen over cotton canvas, was because it had more of an archival resistance to things like humidity and changes in climate. So that's why you'll see a lot of paintings made on linen. It was sort of the industry standard for a really, really long time. It's very time intensive and expensive to create, which makes it really expensive to buy. So I have actually personally never painted on linen. This is the only piece of linen that I have in my studio, and it was a piece that I was just given. But it's not really a size that I have any ideas to work on at the moment. I might mount this to a piece of panel and then paint something on it, but it's just been sitting in my studio. So that's linen canvas. Cotton canvas is a lot more affordable, and you'll see this in most art studios nowadays for that reason. It is a little bit looser of a weave in general. So when we say weave, essentially that's the way that the fibers are being brought together in, sort of verticals and horizontal patterns. And something to think about is the type of canvas that you might want to paint on. So there are types of canvas that are a lot smoother, and there are types of canvas that are a lot rougher in their tooth or that surface quality. There are some that are so rough and loose that it kind of gets into the territory of burlap. You might even be able to purchase like burlap canvas on Dick Blick or other art supplier websites. Some artists, they like to work on burlap because of that tooth and that really rough surface quality and what it does to the paint when you apply paint on the surface. Personally, I like to sit somewhere in the middle, kind of a medium to smooth quality. And the paper or the canvas tends to be kind of a middle weight kind of paper too. So they also judge that by the weight of the canvas. Sometimes the canvas that's really, really smooth is the thinnest and lightest canvas. And I've had canvas rip on accident when I'm trying to stretch it. So that's probably the biggest reason I stay in this middle weight class of canvas. But also I like a little bit of tooth to my canvases. So there are two reasons for that. But make sure you look at those details before you just go and buy, a roll or a blanket of canvas. When you purchase canvas on a website like Dick Blick, it might ship in a bag, like folded up like a blanket. And sometimes that's not an issue or too big of a problem. I've had larger paintings that were made with canvas that was shipped that way that were problematic because it became difficult to get rid of those creases. Like even in this piece here that's been sitting on my shelf for months, now has this crease that it's going to take a little bit more effort and time to try to get rid of that when I stretch this or glue this down to a panel. So you can sometimes avoid this problem of creases by purchasing canvas that's going to ship in a roll. However, that might change the shipping rate and the cost. So just make sure that you're buying what you want to receive. But those are some of the big factors that have stood out to me over the years as being good or bad. So that's pretty much it for canvas and what I would call a loose type of support. So when you get this, you have to then either stretch the canvas around a stretcher, which I don't have any small ones currently at the moment, but I can show you a larger one here. And building stretchers is going to be a whole other video, so I won't really worry about that too much. Actually, you can see on this canvas on my studio floor, the stretcher on the backside is exposed. So the canvas is pulled and wrapped around the backside of the stretcher, then stapled along that back edge, and that creates a really tense or like a strong tension around the front side, almost like a drum, that then is really smooth and durable to paint on. And if I move over here, you can see a few large stretchers that I hope to stretch with canvas here in the next couple months. This is what they look like without the canvas, and they're both facing the front side, so we can see how the stretcher is made with a angled edge to ensure that when this canvas is stretched over, if it's not super tight and it's a little bit loose, which it always usually is, there's a little bit of a give or bounce. When you're painting around the edges, if you're pushing down, you want to make sure that you don't have any sort of material or wood that's up close to the canvas, because when you push down and you paint over that, that edge will start to show up in the painting. So that's why stretchers are made with this angled edge to avoid that problem. So again, I'll talk more about that in the stretcher building video that I'm going to be making here really soon. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this video. I hope that, like I said, it was helpful. If you have any questions about supports and whether or not something is archival, how to seal it, and you can't find that information in another video, please let me know and I can try to answer those questions if you can't find them, through Google or online. That's all I have for you. Best of luck painting, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.